And welcome to Now More Questions, the interview series on European affairs that gets conversations started. You're watching the third episode of our second season, and if you're watching for the first time, or if you have not done so yet, do give us a follow on YouTube to stay informed of the release of our next interviews. Today, we will be discussing the defense of democracy, which is an idea that the European Commission has put forward in its Defense of Democracy package, and particularly in the light of perceived foreign interference on democratic processes or institutions. In the words of the Commission President, Ursula von der Leyen, we need to better shield ourselves from malign interference. This is why we will present a Defense of Democracy package. It will bring covert foreign influence and shady funding to light. We will not allow any autocracy's Trojan horses to attack our democracies from within. Now, democracy has come a long way from its birth in around 500 BC, where democracy was probably more of a privilege than a fundamental right, to today's society, where globalization and digitalization have shifted decision-making away from democratic borders, including, some would argue, within the European Union. And democracies, like any political decision-making system, operate in a geopolitical context that constantly evolves with every conflict or crisis. To help us get to grips with all the ramifications of what a defensive strategy may or may not achieve for democracy, I am joined by Daniela Irrera. Daniela is an associate professor of international relations at the University of Catania. She serves as member of the European Consortium for Political Research. She's a visiting professor of political violence and terrorism at the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe Academy in Bishkek. She is associate editor of the Journal of European Studies and co-editor of the Springer book series on non-state actors in international relations. So Daniela brings a wealth of knowledge and research on relevant topics for our conversation today. So Daniela, welcome to the show and thank you very much for joining.
Hello, thank you so much for having me.
So, Daniela, in the tradition of Now More Questions, I hand over the first question to our previous guest on the show. That was Laetitia Bauchu, president of XR for Europe, and she was interviewed on the topic of virtual worlds.
Okay, so thinking of democracy and the keeping of democratic conversation, I think of freedom of speech and of the media. What is your take on deepfakes and their influence on the media and the information we get? That would be my question.
Well, a very, very interesting question. Also, I would say a very timely question because we are all suffering fake news. So it is also a topic for debate for policymakers, for practitioners, for journalists, but also for students, because there are entire courses given at universities on fake news. It's obviously a sign of our times that we are suffering this problem because we are living in a digital age. On the one hand, it is very important to have access to different sources of information and to have more sources of information available. On the other, we are much more exposed to fake news. So for sure, this is a huge problem because it requires on the part of people who look or watch or read or whatever access they have to digital channels to understand what is true or what is fake, or if this is not possible, at least to have the ability to distinguish, to have opinions which are not influenced so much by information which may be fake. So obviously, any surveillance policy would be too restrictive in my views, but at the same time, what we need is to try to develop more knowledge and more capacities in the audience, and more openness in order to let them distinguish and to develop real opinions, so which may also change, which may also adapt, which are not simply following a news just because they are attractive, because fake news are usually very attractive and very nice, and very. And this is why they are very easy to be believed, obviously. But we need to develop to have more aware societies and more knowledge among people. That would be my answer. That obviously not a real answer because there's nothing I can say in practical terms which can be done, but this is my view.
No, and I think what you're saying is that there is a risk of being manipulated, whether it's in the digital world, and the tools that digital technology provides does allow for manipulation. I mean, you can see it just when you tweak images, for instance. At the same time, when we're talking about democracy, the fundamental principle is that the individual is sovereign.
Yeah.
And when we're talking about the defense of democracy, I understand that there is a perceived threat that the sovereign individual, and therefore the collective within which he is participating, is at risk of being manipulated. So you've spoken briefly about the fake news aspect in relation to the question of our previous guest, but I would like to ask you the question whether you think there is also a manipulation of individuals, of collectives within our democracies by foreign actors. Essentially, do you think democracy is under attack?
Well, I think so, sadly. Well, manipulation is always possible, and unfortunately is very much easier in these current times, for different reasons. So I agree on the fact that democracy is under attack in the EU from different perspectives. So, of course, when you say that there is a manipulation which can come from the external actors, it's very likely to happen, especially in some crucial moments of our democratic life, which are, for example, electoral processes, elections, political elections at any level, and this is relevant. However, I would also add that some important context dealing with the freedom of expression, for example, and civil liberties are severely affected and under attack. So if we look at what is happening in several European countries, so the rise of populist parties and movements, so parties which may be right and far-right parties mainly, and movements, also their impact on governments in several EU countries, which may be, ruling the governments or close to governments. They are imposing restrictive and conservative views in many policy fields, from health to gender policies and also education. For example, attacks to the LGBT communities in Hungary or other European countries, or limitations to academic freedom in many universities, which are happening. For example, this is very sad in countries like France or Netherlands, or even in the UK. These are very significant examples. So when it comes to the foreign interference, for example, the one you were mentioning, and what the Commission is trying to strengthen, a package like the Defense for Democracy package is certainly necessary and is a proactive step. But I also would like to say that it sounds extremely sad, to my view, that democracy should be protected in Europe. I would not say in the EU, but in Europe. So the European Union has been created on democratic principles, and now we are struggling for defending democracy. So we're still debating, and so much and much more we will do in the future, about how we can properly protect democracy. So it's very sad, but at the same time, a sign of the current times, which are affected by different trends compared to the past. The periods in which, as you mentioned, democracies developed and became the most important political regime, as the most the one in which people are happier, let's say, as international relations scholars, but also policy makers and practitioners, as said. So what is absolutely necessary, in my view, is that this package needs to be implemented and applied with the cooperation of various stakeholders. So it should be really representative. Otherwise, it would be another, top-down step on the part of the Commission. So the more stakeholders are involved, the more efficient it can be.
And you say that, and that actually triggers a thought, because I wonder if we understand precisely what is the threat, because we might feel uncomfortable with certain movements within society or certain ideas traveling through society. But in a way, that is also the principle of democracy, is that there is an openness to ideas. Obviously, there are laws, but there is also an openness to ideas. And when you say that there are real impacts from foreign interference, and particularly in important moments for democracy, such as elections, I always try and understand, but how do we actually measure that impact? Because if you only measure the impact on the outcome of an election, that might also simply be, a bias that you might have over whether it's a candidate or an idea or a movement, as opposed to literal foreign interference. How do you actually measure the impact of foreign influence on movements within a democratic society?
But this is a very difficult question. Let me go back to my main research interest, as you mentioned, that are non-state actors and their impact in international affairs. Obviously, it's very, very complicated to measure and to have a quite efficient way to measure such impact. So we can say that usually non-state actors are associated to the promotion of democracy rather than risks and the strengthening. However, they may also entail risks depending on their nature and influence they may have. So, for example, if we discuss about corporations or organizations like medium and large organizations, because it is very hard to see political elite trying to have an influence on electoral processes, but obviously this comes through other actors, which are usually non-state actors. So corporations and medium and large organizations that can have an impact on social media and digital channels mainly. So they are a risk, and they can be, in a way, let's say, measured if they succeed in changing opinions and positions, or modifying opinions and positions obviously in respect to main political parties in a country, or main political movements, or even in other relevant social actors like trade unions or religious organizations and so on. If they succeed in changing or modifying electoral behavior, so let's say moving electoral support from one part to the others. And this obviously may work much better. I mean, more visibly in electoral processes which happen in countries which are marked by different ethnic groups, or different groups marked by different political positions, like recent elections in Kosovo, for example. That there are different ethnic groups which are obviously represented by different political parties. But this is the same even in other countries in Europe, which the impact of ethnic groups is not that strong, but the burden of ideologies may be strong enough. Moving, let's say, the support from one part to the other, this may be much visible or not, but it can be measured as well, in a way. Also, in limiting the access to sources of information, for example, because it may happen that some sources of information are the most preferred, and it is easier to access them and much difficult to access others, for example. Or, and this is the most difficult, because it's the most difficult to measure, in reducing, if they are successful in reducing the space for deliberation, because this is where, and I also refer to like the notion of, philosophical notion of a public sphere, like at the Habermas one. The public sphere is not necessarily a physical space; it can also be a digital one, but a space in which deliberation happen. And when people can participate or can simply listen, but it's essential for shaping opinions and ideas. Obviously, this is part of the game because a digital space is a huge area in which individuals and groups move around. And at the same time, having a control or a monitoring system of this digital space is a dark task for states. And for democratic states, particularly, obviously, because we know that there's another interesting, it's sad, interesting from, let's say, from an investigation point of view, but very sad in practical terms, so which is the phenomenon of digital authoritarianism. In other parts of the world, digital tools are very, very important and useful to illiberal political elite for strengthening illiberalism. So we do not need a digital control. I mean, if we measure such influence, what happens if we measure such influence and we discover that it's too much? And this heavy burden brings a political elite to develop the idea of the necessity of a digital control. This may unpleasantly sound as a digital authoritarianism. So we need digital regulations which are still grounded on consolidated democratic practices. So we can measure, but measuring should not bring to a solution which is not solving the problem, but probably developing more problems, in my opinion.
Yeah, and it's interesting because you talk about the public sphere and the building the public sphere, and I would imagine that a healthy democracy has a healthy, open public sphere, and in many ways the digital space has brought about this promise that we would have a pluralistic, open public sphere in many ways, and politically digitalization has been strongly supported from the get-go. Even without always knowing where digitalization was taking us. And we often think about the problem of censorship on digital platforms, but maybe even more problematic than censorship is actually the fact that our democracies have largely outsourced our pluralistic public sphere type debate to these platforms in a way. And then comes the question of control, because indeed, well, in the end, our democracies are in the hands of very few, very large corporations who also have a strong cooperation with some states, namely across the Atlantic. And we have seen some problems with this level of control and potentially moving forward in the future. So what is your take, especially with your understanding of non-state actors in this digital space? Has there been an emergence of new types of non-state actors that you would say, yes, we really need to be careful about this?
We should be careful, obviously, but not that much, because when I hear the word censorship, I become immediately scared of. I mean, I'm very concerned with the use of anything which is dealing with censorship or control or monitoring or surveillance system. Is something that, in principle, should not be necessary in a democratic setting. But I understand that we have to face new challenges that we were not facing in the past, something absolutely new. At the same time, I would say that nothing can justify a restriction of democratic measures, nothing. Even, as in the past, something like the Patriot Act was a way to justify restrictions to democratic measures because of it was in the name of national security, or even during the pandemic in the name of national health. It was necessary to restrict gatherings, and so there was no space, basically no space for deliberation. So I also believe that during these 2 years, during the lockdown practices that were applied in different ways in all in all the world, in Europe, obviously, but have brought much more difficult, many more difficulties in 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 defending this public sphere that we were mentioning before. So I'm part of these communities of scholars that studied NGOs and civil society organizations in Europe, but not only Europe, obviously, and then civil resistance movements in various parts of continent, and especially at the end of the Cold War, and also having a look at these events, also more recent uprisings like the colored revolutions in the Caucasus, which have also happened in Ukraine, in the Orange Revolution some years ago, or the Arab Springs. So we have all analyzed the features and tools of this bottom-up action. As you said, the states have always been very, very relevant, and so the main actors. So these events that I just mentioned, for example, have sadly demonstrated that democracy, where there is no democracy, it's very unlikely that it starts to flourish as a flower or as a mushroom. So democracy is not a spontaneous outcome, it's not an unconscious outcome. So the non-state actors are necessary, and civil society is also necessary and should be supported and driven. Obviously, what I can say in replying to your question is that freedom cannot be limited because it's the core of our daily life. Our life in democratic countries is that no limitations can be justified. The regulations cannot be too dominant. But at the same time, I can say that freedom cannot turn into a lack of rules at all. It's anarchy, obviously. The regulations cannot be too weak without legitimization, because we also need to have a freedom that respects everyone, so that just freedom for someone's or for some groups and not freedom for others. So also regulations may be necessary, but regulations should also be legitimized. Otherwise, they're just a piece of paper without any impact. So a balance is between respect for freedom and need for regulation is needed, but it's very, 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 very difficult, especially if we consider that next to civil society organizations and NGOs and these, let's say, good guys, good non-state actors, so we also have very, very bad non-state actors, like obviously, terrorist groups or insurgents or private military organizations like the Wagner. And in between, we also have some ambiguous non-state actors like big corporations or big organizations that are simply doing their job. I mean, if we look at NGOs and civil society, they are working for democracy and human promotion. Also, if we look at terrorists, they have their own political goals, which may also bring violence, and violence is justified. In the middle, obviously, we have actors which are close to the economic sphere, that they are just simply doing their job, nothing bad. But obviously, they are not promoting they are not working for democracy, or maybe yes for democracy, but not for human promotion, let's say. So we have all this wide range of actors, and all these actors have an influence. And it's hard to say we can regulate some of them and we cannot regulate some others, or we may impose the same kind of regulation. So this is why it is so difficult.
And that's also why it is important to talk about a sovereign individual, because at the end of the day, a sovereign individual should be exposed to different influences. In an open, pluralistic society, that should be actually a good thing, and then is able to find his own or her own opinion and support an idea that reflects that opinion. And I think in what you're saying as well, but in this balance to be found between some restriction possibly or some regulation, but then largely a lot of freedom, it also comes down to this top-down, bottom-up approach to democratic processes and democratic life. Now, I'm not sure if there would be a very strong bottom-up approach in the European Union right now to say we absolutely need to defend democracy, or if there was a bottom-up approach in that sense, it might be rather, we need to get back control of our national borders within the European Union, within member states. I would say that that's probably a stronger current, very likely, than a current that would say we need to have a general protection of our democracy on European level. So then how do you approach that? Because if the push is not really coming from the bottom up and is rather coming from the top down, with a sort of member states advising the European Commission to come up with a package, because that's usually how it works, and then the European Commission comes up with a set of measures, then needs to try and find the support of civil society organizations. Do you think this is really going to create the kind of framework that you're describing, where we're going to reach a healthy democracy, or will it not ring further alarm bells to many different organizations on the ground who have already warned that putting in place these kinds of measures might actually shrink civic space?
Well, there's a long tradition of dialogue and discussion between the EU institutions, especially the Commission, the Parliament as well, but the Commission mainly the Commission with non-state actors representing civil society. Well, I would say civil society organizations, because when in the EU rhetoric, the NGOs are just one of the actors. So we have civil society organizations, in which we may also have like smaller organizations, smaller associations or lobbyists, groups, various groups, even smaller trade unions, and so on. And they are all always working in different policy fields. That we know that all policy fields are now relevant for the EU action, and they are part of the EU Commission competency. So on the one hand, I would say that it's nothing new, because the Commission has always tried to involve as many civil society organizations as possible, because it is part of the dialogue, the empowerment, as you said, the framework, to build a framework. But then the framework in different policy fields, if we talk, for example, about the migration policies that you mentioned, the need that recently states are trying to support to defend their borders, which is something absolutely with no sense. And now in a second I will tell you why. So if we look at how migration policies have been developed in the EU, and it was the same for the so-called democratization processes in the neighborhood policies and other policies. We see several actors involved, but then in the practice, when it comes to real measures and real dialogues, then the main interlocutors are political elite or local actors, and then civil society disappears, or they are just, they are for a consultation. So the framework is usually put in place, and this is great, because they are always very nice documents with a very nice use of words, diplomatic words, and some of them are from a political scientist like me. It's nice to have a discourse analysis in many documents. But then when we measure, to say what you asked before, to measure the real impact of such policies, then we see it's absolutely difficult to see how much the civil society actors have been able to have an impact, and how influent was the political actors working with the Commission instead. So when it comes to national borders, which is something absolutely with no sense, we are living in a multicultural world which is absolutely open, and the migration flows have always been a component of global trend and global politics. So we see people moving from one part of the world to another in all different parts of the world for different reasons, because they look for a better job. But we may also be like moving from one European country to another for an improvement in our job. So this makes us a migrant. A different kind of migrant, yes, maybe. Are people living because of disasters, natural disasters, of climate change, conflicts? And it is absolutely normal. So the putting a barrier and preventing NGOs. So this is what is happening in the Mediterranean Sea, for example. So NGOs are trying to save and rescue people, and this practice has been simply stopped by Italian state, simply because this is not functional to the let's say state's preferences. It's something against democracy, and it is something that is not inclusive and not legitimate at all. So these are several examples that we may mention. So we see a very nice corner for NGOs and for civil society, and then we see that states are the dominant ones, as usual.
No, I fully agree with you that borders make little sense in the context of migration, apart from the fact that they have to cross them. But when we're talking about democracy, at least that's how democracies have developed in the 20th and 21st century, has been very much linked to the nation, the state. And democracy expresses itself within a border. That is where a collective peoples is in fact sovereign to choose, to decide, to go in a direction that they see fit. And that is obviously challenged within the European Union, and there are certain political parties who who argue that the EU is undemocratic from that perspective. And I don't necessarily want to go there, but it is just to say that borders are essential for democracy, because you need to understand what is the collective that is actually sovereign. And isn't that concept inherently challenged by globalization? And isn't this a much bigger threat in a way than actual foreign interference?
Well, the notion of border have changed quite a lot. I would say that, yes, as you said, the so-called Westphalian state has been at the core of everything. It's nation state. So when nation and state corresponds, and everything is fine because there is no fragmentation, there is order, and there is an almost total representation. So the border is fine and the border is useful. But we also see that the Westphalian state is no more the most important unit, because the notion of borders have changed, and also the political events that happened during the Cold War and after the Cold War, or even after the decolonization process, or after events like the breakup of Yugoslavia, for example, the breakup of Soviet Union. So we saw that many states have been created and been supported, but without corresponding to the nation. Or, for example, we still have some unsolved nations like the Kurdish ones, or if we look at what is happening in many African states like Sudan, for example, and why we have still guerrilla movements which are claiming for a different representation. Say they do not recognize the state as the one in which they represent, they could be represented. So this means that the notion of nation state is in crisis. And if this is the case, we say also that borders may have a crisis. Obviously, if we look at the European Union, so the European Union has been created after the war. And obviously with the dream of creating a free market, but mainly and most importantly for avoiding war, and for avoiding war in relations between among the most important nation states like Germany and France, obviously. So we have several nation states in Europe is based on nation states, but at the same time Europe has lived the crisis of Yugoslavia in the 90s, and it was absolutely unable to manage. And then the newcomers, so the former Soviet dominated countries in Eastern Europe. So the notion of borders have changed quite a lot. I mean, they are still there. Borders are still relevant from an international law point of view. I'm not a lawyer, obviously, but if we talk to an international lawyer, he or she would say, obviously, the border is necessary for identifying a state. But from a political concept, the borders are relevant, but they can be adapted to other kinds of policies if necessary. So if we look at European neighborhood policy, for example, that was a way to develop good relations with neighborhoods, and which were based on bilateral agreements or partnership. This kind of partnership is a political concept. I mean, you are not member of the EU, but you are very close to the EU. So borders may also have been adapted to apply some important policies which were relevant. Nobody would obviously delete borders. This is impossible. But they also should be
No,
adapted.
but I think as a but I think as a citizen in a highly digitalized world, and in a world where there are all sorts of global treaties and agreements and organizations that are weighing on the possibilities for democracies to take their own decisions because they are part of a broader system. I think that's probably the biggest threat in a way, because for a citizen to understand that maybe his vote cannot change anything around him, actually, because the country that he is in is sort of locked into different partnerships, different agreements, different obligations that restrict to some extent the possibilities for a democracy to make certain decisions. I mean, I think that's not as such controversial to say, but it's more a question of getting to understand why democracies are in that position and have decided to go into a more locked partnership with other types of organizations around the world. Isn't that something that citizens maybe struggle to understand?
Yeah, I understand your point. So if we talk about the need for more representation, that the people have the perception that for whom they are voting and what about their vote. So the vote is going to an individual who will rule the country or will take decisions, and the decisions will be available for them as citizens. Of course, I mean, this is the let's say the normal, the traditional model for democracy, obviously. But we have also part of the we are European citizens, so we vote for the European Parliament, and so this is a sovereign election. So we vote for an institution which is a sovereign institution. So we vote for. So the point is to understand that we are citizens of a specific country, and that obviously cannot change, because this is also linked to citizenship and duties and responsibilities, but also part of global citizenship is in a way. Obviously, if we consider this perception, there are more risks. Because obviously we may say Italians should vote for the Italian government, nobody else should have an interference, obviously. So if we are talking about digital interference, so someone is providing more support in terms of money to a specific party for winning, or even for manipulating a little bit the sources of information, that is a problem. Obviously, it's a big problem. But we may also consider that there's another side of the coin, that elections, there's a good, in a way, interference, because in the past, political parties have their own manifestos, and the manifestos were based on, domestic problems, domestic ideas, domestic preferences. But now there are less domestic ideas and preferences, and there are more. We have the same problems everywhere. So the parties' manifesto are also influenced by other things and other events that happen elsewhere. And this is an inevitable, unavoidable interference. That is also part of democracy. So there are more risks, for sure. There are more risks. And it is much more difficult to distinguish the good one from the bad one, in my view.
Yeah, the border is not so easy to define, and maybe then just to hear you on this one, because we've spoken about foreign interference within democracies. I would just like to touch upon the point of foreign interference by democracies as well, because there has been quite an expansionist movement, let's say through enlargement as one part, but then you also have the more militarized democracies, let's say, that tend to intervene in different parts of the world. And this has been, something of the 20th century. The beginning of the 21st century has been pretty much like that as well for a good number of years. I mean, in Iraq, in Afghanistan. What do you think should be the way democracies view the future, the rest of the 21st century? I mean, should democracies continue to interfere around the world? Or given the challenges that we've talked about with the digital sphere, with globalization, with just the health of our own democracies, should we be more maybe inwards focused for the rest of the century and allow for decent geopolitical relations, but no strong foreign policy interference, whether it's military or even more contractual type agreements? Should we still be putting pressure on the rest of the world to become more democratic?
Yeah, another very difficult question. I would say both, and both are necessary, and both are unavoidable, because if we look at the what the U.S. has done in these last years, decades, let's say decades, and also what is happening in the world. So we see that several conflicts. Obviously, some conflicts are much more visible. The conflicts in Ukraine, but we also have to consider that there are conflicts in Syria, in Yemen, in Mali, in Sudan, in Nagorno-Karabakh, for example. There are several conflicts going on, and everything has been completely changed in this last decade. So this means that even foreign policy and diplomacy have changed. So even the idea of foreign policy is much more linked to a less traditional tools and more proactive and adaptive tools of mediation and inclusive dialogue. So everything has changed. From this point of view, the EU has always invested in democracy promotion. So once again, the key words have been, empowerment, inclusion, dialogue, the key words of the EU action, and they've also been used for justify labels associated to the EU, like EU as civilian power, the EU as democracy promoter, and so on. Also, some other ideas not so pleasant for the EU, that EU is the payer, and the US is the player. So, I mean, when it comes to pay, everything is up to the EU, but when it comes to establish political settlements and political agreement, it's up to the US and to the hegemonic power. But at the same time, the EU has expanded also, for example, the civilian nature of peace missions, as you mentioned before, the militarization. But at the same time, the EU has deployed an increasing number of civilian missions in strategic parts of the world. Now it's deploying less missions, but for different reasons, because of change in military expenditures, or because funds were diverted to other policies during the pandemic. But still, this number may increase again in the future. So several civilian missions working on rule of law, security sector reform, policing, in different parts of the world, mainly in the African continent, but also in Asia, for example, or in the Balkans, and there are still several missions which are deployed. At the same time, we have to recognize that several mistakes have been made. So the so-called liberal peace model, on which peacekeeping operations and external interventions have been grounded, has failed to bring real democracy. As you mentioned before, Afghanistan, that Afghanistan is now ruled by, happily, from their point of view, by the Taliban, despite all the investments made by the US and European countries in the area. Or Iraq is not a stable democracy for sure. So that this is the same. So that the Palestinian conflict is still going on in a more violent way. So in many troubled areas, the liberal peace model has failed. So the peace model was also grounded on democratic principles and the need to bring democratic packages on that regions. on those regions. So many of the EU policies and measures, once again, I mentioned the European neighborhood policy, but also the Mediterranean dialogue, have been created and crafted as a package, literally package, applied literally again without effective knowledge of local instability, local fragmentation. I really believe that the EU still has to deepen and consolidate at the same time democracy abroad, but at the same time the EU still has to deepen and consolidate democracy at home. So the challenge is the EU and the international community in which the EU is included will face and in the future several challenges, and so that continue. So the EU should continue to be a provider of democracy, but should be a provider of a democracy which is not in crisis. So a democracy which can help, because otherwise we are simply bringing a model, a package which is not working, and we know for sure that it's not working. So once again, we need to be more adaptive. So democracy or something similar to democracy should always be, brought, obviously conflicts should be managed in a way. So that the point is that it's very difficult to continue.
Yeah, it will be a tricky one to justify to some extent foreign interference for democracy, but not when it comes to influence on democracy, let's say, and at the same time to position this democratic foreign interference in the context of geopolitical realities, because sometimes there are some slightly vain promises that are made to populations in around the world that just simply do not take into account certain realities of geopolitics, and not everything comes from a peace plan as such. Sometimes there requires other interventions, and maybe for democracies that's something to think about for the 21st century. But Daniela, thank you so much. You've shared a lot of really fascinating insights on a very broad and complex topic, defending democracy. I'd like to really thank you so much for having taken the time to be with us.
It was great to discuss and to reply to your very difficult questions. Thank you.
That was Daniela Irrera, Associate Professor of International Relations at the University of Catania. Fascinating insights into a tough conversation on defense of democracy. And we'll be hearing more on that throughout the year. There will be 2 more episodes devoted to defense of democracy. So in the meantime, do follow us on YouTube, on LinkedIn, on Twitter, and stay tuned for our next episodes.